Hi, this is Ike from Groovy Entertainment. Today we got another record to play for you. Today's record is Rip Van Winkle, so let's get started.
Whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. At the foot of these mountains, there is a village, and in one of these houses, there lived a simple, good-natured fellow of the name Rip Van Winkle. He was a descendant of the Van Winkles, who figured so gallantly in the days of Peter Stuyvesant. He was, moreover, a kind neighbor and an obedient, hen-pecked husband. He was a great favorite among all the good wives of the village, who took his part in all family squabbles. The children of the village would shout with joy whenever he approached. He helped make their playthings, taught them to fly kites, shoot marbles, told them stories of ghosts, witches, and Indians. The great error in Rip's composition was an insufferable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor. Rip was ready to attend to anybody's business but his own. And as to doing family duty and keeping his farm in order, he found it impossible. In fact, he declared it was of no use to work his farm. It was the most pestilent little piece of ground in the whole country. Everything about it went wrong. It was the worst farm in the neighborhood. His children were ragged and wild, as if they belonged to nobody. Rip Van Winkle was one of those happy mortals who would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. If left to himself, he would have whistled life away in perfect contentment. But his wife kept dinning in his ears about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Rip's sole domestic adherent was his dog Wolf, who was as much henpecked as his master. Times grew worse and worse with Rip Van Winkle. For a long time, he used to console himself by frequenting a perpetual club of other idle personages of the village, which held its sessions on a bench before a small inn. Finally, poor Rip's only alternative was to take gun in hand, stroll into the woods. Here he would sometimes seat himself at the foot of a tree and share his food with Wolf. In a long ramble of the kind you do on a fine autumn day, Rip had scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Catskill Mountains. He was squirrel shooting, then panting, fatigued, and he threw himself on a green knoll. For some time, Rip lay musing. Evening was gradually advancing, and he heaved a heavy sigh when he thought of encountering the terrors of Dame Van Winkle. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice calling his name. He looked around, but could see nothing. He turned again to descend, and heard his name called again. Looking down the glen, Rip saw a strange figure slowly tooling up the rocks. On nearer approach, he was surprised at the stranger's appearance. He was a short, square-built old fellow, dressed in the antique Dutch fashion. He bore on his shoulder a stout keg that seemed full of liquor. and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. Rip complied, and as they ascended, Rip heard long, rolling peals like distant thunder that seemed to issue out of a deep ravine between lofty rocks. Passing through the ravine, they came to a hollow, like a small amphitheater. On entering the amphitheater, he saw a company of odd-looking personages playing at ninepins. They were dressed in a quaint, outlandish fashion. They all had beards. The whole group reminded Rip of the figures in an old Flemish painting. What seemed odd to Rip was that though these folks were evidently amusing themselves, they maintained the gravest faces. As Rip and his companion approached them, they desisted from their play and stared at him. His companion emptied the contents of the keg into flagons and made signs to him to wait upon the company. By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured to taste the beverage. He was soon tempted to repeat the draught. He reiterated his visits to the flagon so often that at length he fell into a deep sleep. Found himself on the green knoll whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. Rip could not believe he had slept there all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep. The strange man with the keg of liquor, the mountain ravine, the woebegone party at Ninoy's, the flagon. What excuse would he give to Dan Van Winkle? He looked around for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled piece, he found an old firelock lying by him. Wolf, too, had disappeared. He determined to revisit the scene of last night's gamble. But as he arose to walk, he found himself stiff in the joints. With some difficulty, he got down to the glen, and at length reached the ravine which had opened to the amphitheater. No traces of such opening remained. He shook his head, shouldered the rusty firelock, and with a heart full of trouble and anxiety, turned his steps homeward. As he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none whom he knew, and their dress, too, was of a different fashion from that to which he was accustomed. All stared at him, and whenever they cast their eyes upon him, they stroked their chins. Rip did the same, and found his beard had grown a foot long. The village was altered. It was larger and more populous. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before, and those which had been his familiar haunts had disappeared. It was with some difficulty that he found the way to his house. He found that his house had gone to decay. He entered the house. It was empty and abandoned. He now hurried to the village inn, but it too was gone. A large building stood in its place. There was a crowd of folk about the door, but none that Rip recollected. The appearance of Rip soon attracted the attention of the tavern regulars. He told them he was looking for some of his neighbors and friends. The crowd asked him to name them. Whoever Rip named, he was told, they were dead. Rip's heart died away at hearing of these sad changes. He had no courage to ask after any more friends, and cried out in despair if anybody knew Rip Van Winkle. He was told that Rip Van Winkle was leaning against yonder tree. Rip looked and held a precise counterpart of himself. Rip, he was mighty confused. The crowd spoke of taking Rip to the jail. At this moment, a woman pressed through the crowd. She was holding a child in her arms. She told the child to hush and called him Rip. The name of the child, the air of the mother, the tone of her voice awakened recollections in Rip's mind. He asked the woman what her name was and who was her father. She said that Rip Van Winkle was his name, but he went away 20 years ago and has never been heard of since. Rip had but one question more. He asked about her mother. The woman told him she was dead. He could not contain himself any longer, and Rip caught his daughter and her child in his arms and told her he was her father. All stood amazed. Rip's story was soon told, for the whole 20 years had been to him but as one night. Rip's daughter took him home to live with her. Rip resumed his old walks and habits. He soon found many of his former cronies, with whom he soon grew into great favor. He once more took his place on the bench at the inn door, and was reverenced as one of the patriarchs of the village. He used to tell his story to every stranger that arrived at the hotel. Some, they pretended to doubt the story, but the old Dutch inhabitants gave it full credit. Even to this day, they never hear a thunderstorm about the Catskill. But they say Hendrik Hudson and his crew are at their game of 9 pins. And it is a common wish of all henpecked husbands, when life hangs heavy on their hands, that they might have a quieting draught out of Rip Van Winkle's flagon.
So that was Rip Van Winkle. So if you like, subscribe, share, and comment. Have a groovy day with another video coming out real soon.